like to start out by telling you about a recurring dream that I have. And this isn't a joke, it's a real dream. It's always been unsettling for me. I don't have it often, thankfully, because it leaves me quite shaken whenever I wake up. But I've had it more than once throughout the years, and it always just has a pronounced effect on me. I will tell you that oddly enough it has to do with the church. Whenever I have this dream, I find myself in the middle of a church building. And what happens in the dream disturbs me so much that I end up waking myself from the dream. I don't know if I'm sure some of you can do that when you're in the middle of nightmares. I'll always reach the point in mind, and I just can't take it anymore. And so I decide I don't want to do this anymore, I can't do this anymore. And the dream version of fight or flight switches from fight to flight, and I somehow gain enough consciousness to wake up and leave it behind. So, as I said, whenever I have this dream, I find myself in the middle of a church building. I believe once before it's been the building over there at Park Road, but usually it's a building I don't recognize. I just know it is a church building. And in that dream, someone always comes up and they tell me it's time to preach. And I realize I don't have a lesson. And I am completely unprepared. I had no idea. And in the dream, I'll grab my iPad and I'll start searching for a sermon, trying to pull it off of the cloud, something that I'm familiar with that I can preach. But if you've ever had one of those nightmares where you are desperately trying to reach someone, to save them, to tell them something, and no matter what you do, somehow you can never quite get to them, well, something just keeps going wrong on the iPad, and I'll type letters and they'll just disappear, and just stuff keeps happening, and I can't find the lesson. Now, I do have a variation on that dream every now and then where I can't find a tie, which is ridiculous because, and the first time I remember having that dream, I preached for a small country church in Alabama. We don't wear ties. But in this dream, I am searching and searching and searching, and I can't find a tie. And no matter what I do, I can never get to it. And it's just going to be a disaster because if I can't get that tie, I can't get up there and preach, and it just freaks me out. But finally, I get tired of the struggle. I'm all alone. I can't do anything right, and I just give up and wake up. Thankfully, I've never had a waking moment that resembled that nightmare. But I have had times when it felt as if nothing was going right. And there have been challenges and discouragements that seem to compound one thing on top of another. And you might not be weird enough to have experienced the nightmare scenario of not being able to find a tie and thus all is lost. But perhaps you've known the other sort of scenario where it seems like it's just one thing after the other. And it's just getting too hard. And you start thinking, well, maybe the best tack is just to quit and give up. In my dream, all of that doesn't matter very much because none of it's real and all I'm actually doing is waking up. But if you've ever felt like that spiritually, where it all feels too much, and maybe you don't want to do this anymore, maybe you wouldn't give up completely on your faith. Maybe it is that you have been so low before that you actually did think about walking away from the Lord. Maybe in years past you even did that at some point in your life. I think more often than not, the level of quitting that tempts us most is not a complete abandonment, it's a partial retreat. So you don't leave the faith, but you do leave behind your zeal. And you make sure to still take a seat, but you don't take the initiative. If you would, join me please in 1 Kings chapter 18 for our study this evening. There are a number of characters in the Bible that get that low spiritually, but certainly one of them is the prophet Elijah. I'd like to study a story from his life that I imagine you know well, and I want to talk about Elijah from the context of rising above discouragement. Once again, I think if we're honest with ourselves, we've probably all been there one way or another. It might just be that you were there right now. Or perhaps there's some discouragement in the future that's going to threaten to put you in that spot spiritually, where you find yourself closer than you expected to throwing in the towel, whatever that would look like for you. I hope that the text we'll study this evening will motivate us to rise above those discouragements, not to give up to them. So you remember the prophet Elijah. It is by means of his very godly lifestyle and godly message that he stands in extreme contrast to the current occupants of the throne in Israel, namely Ahab and Jezebel. Ahab, because of his great wickedness, was not content to just follow in his father's footsteps. He raised the bar with sinfulness. He built altars to Baal. He built a temple for Baal to be worshipped in. And Jezebel took it even further still, attempting to strike down and eradicate all the prophets of God. And because of their wickedness, God, through the message of Elijah, brought a famine on the land for 3.5 years. And God then sends Elijah to speak to Ahab. And Elijah goes and finds a high-ranking servant in Ahab's household by the name of Obadiah. And he tells Obadiah to tell Ahab that Elijah wants a meeting with him. Obadiah is actually a very good man. When Jezebel started killing God's prophets, he started hiding and protecting them. But when he hears Elijah's request, he says, well, what did I do to you? He said, what have I done wrong that you are handing your servant over to Ahab to be put to death? He says, that's what your request means. He explains, as surely as the Lord your God lives, there is not a nation or kingdom where my master has not sent someone to look for you. And whenever a nation or kingdom claimed you were not there, he made them swear they could not find you. But now you tell me to go to my master and say, Elijah is here, and I don't know where the Spirit of the Lord may carry you when I leave you. If I go and tell Ahab and he doesn't find you, he will kill me. He says, I, your servant, have worshipped the Lord since my youth. And now you tell me to go to my master and say, Elijah is here. He will kill me. And Elijah says, as the Lord Almighty lives whom I serve, I will surely present myself to Ahab today. And he does. Ahab meets with Elijah. You might remember the interaction that they have as Ahab sees him from afar and says, is that you, you troubler of Israel? And Elijah says, I've not made trouble for Israel. It's you and your father's family that have done so. You've abandoned God's commands. You've followed the Baals. You're the one who's brought this trouble on all of us. But ultimately what happens in this story is that Elijah issues a challenge to Ahab. So in verse 19 he says, summon the people from all over Israel to meet me on Mount Carmel, and bring the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah. So you bring your prophets, and I'll represent the God of heaven. That's one of those stories a lot of us learn from a very early age. And what they're going to do is they're going to call for a display of power from their gods. They're going to construct the altar, they're going to lay the offering on it, but they won't add the fire. They'll call on their gods to do that. So verse 26. So they took the bull given them and prepared it. And then they called on the name of Baal from morning till noon. Baal, answer us, they shouted. But there was no response. No one answered. They danced around the altar they had made. And at noon, Elijah began to taunt them. And I love this part because Elijah becomes something of a smart mouth, taunting them. He says, shout louder. Surely he is a god. Perhaps he is deep in thought, or busy, or traveling. Or maybe he's sleeping and must be awakened. So they shouted louder and slashed themselves with swords and spears as was their custom until their blood flowed. Midday passed and they continued their frantic prophesying until the time for the evening sacrifice. But there was no response. No one answered. No one paid attention. And then it's Elijah's turn. So he's built the altar, he prepares the animal, but then as you remember, he tells them to do something before they get this started. He says, bring 4 large containers full of water and pour them out on the altar, douse the whole area. And then he says, do it again. And then he says, do it a 3rd time. And the whole area is soaking wet. And in verse 36, at the time of the sacrifice, the prophet Elijah stepped forward and prayed. And I just wish we knew, is he praying this very loudly for all around to be able to hear him? Or is he praying in contrast to the ridiculous, I lost my word, all the shouting and carrying on of the prophets of Baal? Is he just offering a simple, humble prayer and request to God? Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and have done all these things at your command. Answer me, Lord, so that these people will know that you, Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again. And of course, God answers in dramatic fashion. Verse 38, the fire of God falls and burns up the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and the soil, licks up everything that's there. And temporarily, the people are swayed. They cry out, the Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God. And Elijah capitalizes on the moment. He commands them to seize the prophets of Baal, slaughters every one of them. And God tells Elijah that the rains are going to return. Elijah sends word to Ahab again, telling him, hurry on home, rain's coming. And it seems like the kind of victory that is going to make a difference. And it doesn't. Jezebel will send word to Elijah and say, I will kill you by tomorrow. And Elijah flees into the wilderness. And it's there that he just sits down under a tree and prays for what the first time you read it is a very surprising prayer. Because he says all of a sudden, I've had enough, Lord. Take my life. I'm no better than my ancestors. Now eventually, he's going to journey on down to Mount Horeb where Moses received the law. And where Moses asked on that same mountain to see the presence of the Lord, and God hid him in the cleft of the rock and passed by him to grant him that glimpse of His glory, God's going to make another appearance of sorts on Mount Sinai. And God sends displays of power and a great wind and an earthquake and a fire, but His presence isn't in any of those, however all that works. But it's in the quiet stillness that follows that God speaks in a whisper and asks Elijah twice, what are you doing here, Elijah? And Elijah says, I have been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. And I'm the only one left. And now they're trying to kill me too. So I have tried so hard to do the right thing. And it hasn't worked. And it hasn't gotten any easier. And I feel like I'm fighting all by myself. So I want to talk about Elijah in this particular moment as spiritually he is despairing and despondent. Imagine on one level or another we can relate to this. The first thing that I want us to consider about this spiritual discouragement in which Elijah finds himself, and that perhaps we have too, is that it's the sort of thing that can happen fast or it can happen slow. What we don't know about Elijah's situation and the prayer that he offers is, has this been building for years within him? It is certainly possible. He served his role as a prophet during the reign of Ahab. Ahab's even worse than his father Omri. Elijah's never known a good king. He's never lived in a good spiritual condition. The conflict between Ahab, Jezebel, and Elijah has been going on for years now. And then no matter what he does, he can't seem to change anything. So could it be that Elijah's just been worn down by time? Or is this discouragement as sudden as it appears in the story? What's surprising about this story is Elijah has just had a literal mountaintop experience. He should be charged up, ready to go. In the face of Ahab and the prophets and the worshipers of Baal, he has prayed and God has answered in a mighty demonstration that Yahweh is God, not Baal. It is the greatest victory he's ever experienced in his life. Here he is spiritually in the valley, ready to die. So discouragement can work these different ways. It can work slow, like water eroding stone. And you've got time and circumstances and people that can just wear us down over years to where you just are done. You want to give up. Or it can happen almost suddenly. You can be feeling pretty good and suddenly something completely unexpected throws you for a loop. It doesn't go at all the way you thought it would. And it's such a punch in the gut that your knees buckle. So you remember what Elijah prays, what he expects. He's called the people before the challenge and he said to them, how long will you waver between two opinions? How long will you vacillate between different gods? If the Lord is God, follow him. If Baal is God, follow him. Make up your mind. That's all like what Joshua said. Remember, choose this day whom you will serve. And then he had prayed, answer me, Lord, so that these people will know that you, Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again. So he seems to think this is going to be a critical moment for the people of God. And it isn't. So maybe you face something like that. Maybe you tried to do something with your brothers and sisters in Christ. You wanted to have maybe a Bible class or a home study, something to spend time with them, something to encourage them. You're excited about it. You put time into it, effort and money, getting everything ready, and you think this is going to be great. Everyone's going to love the study that we're going to have. They're going to love this get-together with one another. It's going to be an encouraging time for everybody, and you get behind it, and you sacrifice, and it flops. 3 people show up. And you want to give up. Elijah feels alone. Now God's going to remind him he is not alone. There are 7,000 who are faithful to the Lord and have thus far refused Baal. But none of them are on Mount Horeb right now. And Elijah feels alone. And of course, he isn't imagining the source of his discouragement. Part of the reason he feels so alone is because Jezebel's been successful in killing so many of his fellow prophets. They could not stand beside him if they wanted to because they were gone. So he feels alone. And that leads to his discouragement. The second point I want to consider from the discouragement in the life of Elijah really comes from the other side of all this, and that is from the people. From those who should have supported Elijah, but instead on Mount Carmel it's hundreds to 1. What if just someone had stood with him? What if a single family had showed up and said, Elijah, we're with you. We'll gather the wood for the fire. Again, Elijah's not imagining the discouragement. Somewhere around him there are 7,000 who share his convictions, but at the moment he can't see any of them. So he feels alone, he feels outnumbered. Now that sort of thing can tear at a Christian zeal just about as quick as anything. I don't know if any of you have seen the book called Passionate People. It's written by a man named Keith Miller. And in the book, he uses the illustration of 2 types of people in life. I don't know if he came up with the illustration or not, but he talks about balcony people and basement people. And what I want you to ask yourself is, which one am I? So in the book, Miller talks about basement people as the kind of person who is always trying to pull you down to where they stay. So their favorite kinds of sayings are, it's not going to work, or you've tried that before, or why bother? They're the kind of people who, as the phrase goes, have a problem for every solution and describe about all the problems. And again, as the phrase goes, misery loves company, and they are trying to get you to join them in the basement. But then he talks about balcony people, and those are the folks who are up in the loft. Those are the ones who, they don't even have the best seats, but they just want to be there that much. And they're always applauding, and they are cheering you on. They're the die-hard fans. So he uses the metaphor of the kind of people who cheer for the young girl on stage, trying her very best to sing a song and forgetting every single one of the words. And yet they're applauding anyway. Or he mentions a young boy playing a trumpet and getting none of the notes right, but they give him an ovation when he finally stumbles to the end. So they're the kind of people who are always encouraging and lifting up folks and saying, we can do this. How can I help? I'm glad you're here. I'm thankful for you. So take a moment for some honest reflection, and let's just ask, what kind of person am I? Am I a basement person or a balcony person? Would I have been there to cheer on Elijah and encourage him, or would I have just stayed home and not wanted to get involved? Or would I have been the person to put a hand on his shoulder and say, Elijah, I'm sorry. This is hard. These people are lousy. But don't give up. So if right now you're discouraged and you're feeling alone, what I want to do is just warn you to watch for some signs of discouragement. So that you can make the necessary corrections before it pulls you down. So look at Hebrews chapter 12, verses 14 and 15. Strive for peace with everyone and for the holiness without which no one will see the Lord. See to it that no one fails to obtain the grace of God. And notice this, that no root of bitterness springs up and causes trouble, and by it many become defiled. So the writer is cautioning us not to fall away. He's warning us that one sure sign that you are at risk of doing just that is a root of bitterness. That's something that's easier to see in others than in ourselves. But that is a clear sign someone's faith is in jeopardy, when they become bitter. Bitter and negative about most things, about most people. Just hard to find a positive thing that they appreciate. But along with watching out for that, may I suggest that we do whatever we can to be the reason, or at least one of the reasons, that the people around us don't give up. Some of you, I'm sure, remember Jason Harden, who preached at Laurel Canyon for a number of years. He posted a picture on his Facebook page of something his 14-year-old daughter had written on a chalkboard in their house. Some of you may have seen it. It said, "Be the reason that someone believes in the goodness of God." Be the reason someone believes in the goodness of God. You know, sometimes a congregation has shepherds and deacons and evangelists that deserve appreciation and championing and support, but sometimes those pieces aren't in place. What you always have, no matter what, is many members who step up to do what he's doing. They pick up the task. In some cases, they pick up the slack, and they help the congregation do the work of the Lord. Those people need our support and our acknowledgement and our gratitude. They need that. Over in 2 Corinthians 12, in that epistle, Paul has had to defend himself to the Christians in Corinth. There were people who did not appreciate the harsh message that he had to send them in 1 Corinthians, and thinking if they can strike down the writer, they can strike down the message, they called his apostleship into question. They tried to shame him and tear him down. Paul seems to have expected that from his opponents, but what seems to have really bothered him is that his brethren didn't stand up for him. So he says things like this in 2 Corinthians 12 and verse 11. "I have become a fool in boasting." And what he means is as I've had to defend myself and state my credentials, it sounds as if I'm boasting about myself, and that's just about the last thing I wanted to do. So I've had to do this. You've compelled me to it. You put me in a situation where I didn't have any other choice. He says, "For I ought to have been commended by you. For in nothing was I behind the most eminent apostles, though I am nothing. Truly, the signs of an apostle were accomplished among you with all perseverance in signs and wonders and mighty deeds. For what is it in which you were inferior to other churches, except that I myself was not burdensome to you?" He says, in what way did you find yourself less than any of the other congregations, except for the fact that I didn't charge you anything when I was working there among you and preaching for you? He says, "Forgive me this wrong. Now for the third time I'm ready to come to you, and I will not be burdensome to you, for I do not seek yours, but you. For the children ought not to lay up for the parents, but the parents for the children, and I will very gladly spend and be spent for your souls. Though the more abundantly I love you, the less I am loved. But be that as it may, I did not burden you. But nevertheless, being crafty, I caught you by cunning." I imagine you can hear the hurt in all of that. You force me to look like a fool because it looks like I'm boasting when I'm just having to defend myself because you wouldn't do it. And you should have done it. You should have stepped up for me. He says in chapter 13 and verse 5, "Examine yourselves as to whether you are in the faith. Test yourselves. Do you not know yourselves that Jesus Christ is in you? Unless indeed you are disqualified." I don't believe his point there is actually just about general self-examination. I believe, given the context, his point is, are you a Christian or not? And they would say, well, of course we are. And Paul's point is, how did you get to be a Christian? It was me. So examine yourselves. Are you in the faith? Yes, you are. Why are you? Who preached the gospel to you? I did. So he's challenging them to examine their relationship with the one who's done so much for them in the Lord and to love him like they should. Now, given this is Paul and Corinth, this passage obviously would find its closest parallel when you have elders and deacons and evangelists who aren't being supported and appreciated the way they deserve to be. But I want to extend that and make it more relevant to the entirety of the group. Both at Park Road and here, you and I have many teachers and more who lead us spiritually by example in this congregation than just the different evangelists that you have come to stand in this pulpit. You have many more teachers and spiritual leaders than that, and we need to be their champion and support them. And then beyond even the members of this congregation who stand out by the degree to which they step up, we're supposed to see all of our brethren as fellow laborers working together in God's vineyard. Everyone in the pews in the midst of the service as fellow soldiers in God's army. We're all in it together. And that goes for the easy, cheerful times, and it goes for the challenging, discouraging times too, and it goes as double for those. So just one small word of intentional kindness, some deliberate effort made to see something positive about them and to tell them that you appreciate it. And when things get hard, when challenges come and it's discouraging, remember that you love them and you need your brethren and you are very thankful to have them. I can't tell you how grateful I am that the congregation I get to work with on a full-time basis over at Park Road, in my estimation, excels in this in many ways. For starters, do you know how many extra pounds I carry because of all the meals they brought to my family during countless different occasions? Crystal's sick all the time. We eat well. Or how many kind encouragements after lessons and classes or questions that show me they're digging into the subject more and it's captured their attention. One of my favorite is when someone tells me how the message seemed to really resonate with their child and what the child said about it afterwards. Or the caring way in which they bring a disagreement or a criticism. And we don't have an eldership right now, but I can't tell you how many times when we did have an eldership, how often they made it very clear they had my back. They had my back. Again and again and again, moments from all of them that make me feel appreciated. I don't think I've ever had cause to mention this here. And we won't spend time talking about it, but I'm not going to go into just how much I wanted to quit preaching at both of my previous works. There were good people as a part of those congregations, but there was a lot of challenges, and there were many, many different times all throughout those years that I just thought about not doing it anymore. But I will tell you, because of my brothers and sisters in Christ, for example, over at Park Road, I don't feel that way anymore. They're balcony people. They lift each other up. They don't allow each other to get too far down. And that's what we need to be for one another. If we will be, we can do as Elijah does, and we can go from darkness to light. It's easy to relate to Elijah being in the darkness. But God comes to Elijah and he asks him, what are you doing here? What are you doing here, Elijah? So discouragement can take you places, if you will. It can take us to places we shouldn't be. And when discouragement threatens to do that to us, I want you to hear the voice of God in this text saying, what are you doing here? So Elijah goes to his cave and he hides there. Everybody has a coping mechanism. Sometimes they're harmless, other times they're not. A coping mechanism to help us deal with discouragement. Sometimes the coping mechanism is to lash out at people. Sometimes the coping mechanism is like mine in that ridiculous nightmare. I can't do it anymore, and so I left. Elijah's was to hide in a cave. And God draws him out of that cave and gives him a job to do. He said, you go and anoint Hazael to be king of Syria. Go and anoint Jehu to be king of Israel. Go and anoint Elisha to be your successor. And then we're going to clean house. We're going to take care of all this problem, Elijah, and we're going to deal with all of these false prophets. So God tries to bring Elijah out of that darkness and into the light. I think we can learn something from how he does this, about how we can get from darkness to light. First of all, we'll go through these very quickly. We need to fix our eyes on God. So God makes that appearance to Elijah in his darkest moment with that soft whisper. You and I can hear that whisper and then some in his word. And then on top of that, you and I can be those balcony people. We can be that whisper of God, reminding them of God's presence in their life. I'm sure you know well Philippians 4 when Paul says, I've learned in whatever situation I am to be content. He says, I know how to be brought low. I know how to abound. In any and every circumstance, I've learned the secret. In regards to facing plenty and hunger or abundance and need. And the secret is I can do all things through him. So Paul knew his hardships. But he knew the Lord. And between the hardship and the Lord, it was just about as much a contest as it was between the Lord and those prophets of Baal. And then secondly, along with making sure that we focus on God, we need to look and see the good around us. It's one of the things God tries to do with Elijah. He tries to say, listen, it's bad. But it's not all bad. So again, back in Philippians 4, remember when Paul says, brethren, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just or pure, lovely, commendable, if there's any excellence or anything that's worthy of praise, he says, think about these things. It's really easy to do the opposite and focus on the negative. Paul says, focus on the praiseworthy. Focus on the lovely. Focus on the commendable. Think about stuff like that. And then thirdly, every time you just need to take some time to rest and renew. It's humorous to me that in this point in the story, one of the things that Elijah needs is a nap and a good meal. And sometimes we just need exactly that. Other times we need the spiritual equivalent to that, whatever it may be, to recharge our batteries, go to a gospel meeting, go to a singing, perhaps step away for some quiet time in prayer, asking for perspective, meditating on those good things, and resting up. Not going away, but taking some time and resting up with the intent to get right back in there. And then also, as God wanted Elijah to do, realize you're not alone. There are many more than 7,000 pairs of knees in this country that haven't bowed to worldliness or immorality. You're not alone. And the answer to Elijah's discouragement was, Elijah, now that you've had a nap and a cry and a meal, let's get up and get to work. There is more to do before your time is done. So if I might add, find something you can do. Find someone who seems to be spiritually weaker than you and try to encourage them. Be a balcony person on purpose to pull them up. You'll find they often push you up as well. And both of you get to grow. So I appreciate very much your attention this evening as we talked about hitting the low points and trying to climb up out of them. Ultimately, whatever you do, don't give up. And when it gets tough, take these steps. Look around and look carefully. And it's usually not as bad as it seems. There is always reason to appreciate what you do have. And see God in your life. See the good in your life. Look for someone who can lift you up. and look for someone that you can lift up. And let's cheer one another on. Let's root for each other. It's so easy to let the differences in our personalities and the little idiosyncrasies about one another that we might not particularly care for to be the absolutely ignorant kind of stuff that gets in the way of being the people of God Jesus died to make us to be. We need to be each other's champion. If by chance you're not a Christian this evening, you have a group of people here who will cheer for you as you make the best decision of your life, and who will encourage you and lift you up and help you reach your goal. And I hope you will make that decision this evening. Let's stand and sing.